Gripping the heavy leather harness of his German shepherd, Kaiser, Corporal Dave Reynolds, stood transfixed in aisle 4 of Carter's Family Market. Just a few feet away, an elderly man in a worn field jacket trembled, staring helplessly at a register demanding $3.86 he couldn't pay. Before Dave could reach for his wallet to spare the man further humiliation, Kaiser broke his ironclad discipline. In a fraction of a second, the highly decorated, Navy SEAL-trained K-9 lunged, shattering the sickly yellow hum of the store's fluorescent lights. The aisles dissolved into screams as a violent truth was abruptly laid bare, spilling a 50-year-old secret right onto the linoleum floor. The rain in Highgrove, Ohio, didn't just fall. It punished. It was the kind of freezing, relentless downpour that seeped into your bones and woke up every old ache, every healed fracture, and every piece of shrapnel still lodged deep in the muscle. For 28-year-old Marine Corporal David Reynolds, the weather was a fitting backdrop to a life that had felt permanently gray since he was medically discharged 14 months ago. Dave walked with a pronounced limp, his right leg heavily braced beneath his denim jeans, a permanent souvenir from an IED in the Helmand province. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the invisible ones. His only real anchor to the civilian world walked quietly by his left side, its claws clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement. Kaiser was not an ordinary service dog. He was 100 pounds of pure, coiled muscle, wrapped in a jet black and mahogany coat, a purebred German shepherd. Kaiser possessed an intelligence that was often deeply unsettling to those who didn't know him. He didn't just look at you, he calculated you. Kaiser had been bred, raised, and trained by the United States Navy SEALs, originally assigned to Dave's older brother, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds. Thomas had been a handler for SEAL Team 6, and Kaiser had been his shadow through 4 classified deployments. When Thomas was killed in action during a night raid in Yemen, Kaiser had been right there beside him, taking a graze from a 7.62 round to his shoulder while standing over Thomas's body. The dog had refused to let anyone approach until the medevac arrived. The Navy, recognizing the dog's profound grief and knowing he would likely never bond with another operational handler in the same way, made a rare exception. They retired Kaiser and released him into Dave's custody. Dave needed saving, and Kaiser needed a mission. They had been inseparable ever since. Kaiser's training was unparalleled. He wasn't just taught to bite and hold. He was trained in explosives detection, stress pheromone tracking, and advanced medical anomalies. He could smell a spike in cortisol from 30 yards away. He knew the scent of a concealed weapon. He understood hand signals, eye movements, and the subtle shifts in human physiology that preceded violence or collapse. Pushing open the heavy glass doors of Carter's Family Market, Dave shook the water from his jacket. "Heel, Kaiser," he murmured softly. The shepherd instantly glued himself to Dave's left leg, his golden eyes scanning the brightly lit interior of the grocery store. The sudden warmth of the building was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, carrying the smells of stale bread, floor wax, and damp wool. Dave grabbed a plastic shopping basket, his knuckles white against the red handle. Grocery shopping was always a tactical exercise for him. He hated the crowds, the unpredictable noises, the way people stood too close. "Just milk, coffee, and eggs, buddy," Dave whispered to the dog. In and out. Kaiser gave a low, barely perceptible huff, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. They navigated the store methodically. Dave kept his back to the aisles, scanning the intersecting lanes out of habit. The store was moderately busy for a Tuesday evening. Mothers corralling toddlers, tired factory workers grabbing frozen dinners, and teenagers stocking up on energy drinks. It was a perfectly normal, violently mundane slice of American life. But as they rounded the corner toward the front checkout lanes, Kaiser's behavior shifted. It wasn't a sudden, aggressive movement. It was a subtle, structural change. The dog's shoulders stiffened. His tail dropped an inch. His nose lifted, taking in a long, deliberate drag of the recycled air. Dave felt the tension instantly transfer through the rigid handle of the leather harness. "What is it?" Dave asked, his voice dropping an octave. Kaiser didn't look at Dave. His intense, unblinking gaze was locked on Register 3. Dave followed the dog's line of sight. At the checkout counter stood an elderly man. He was shockingly frail, his shoulders hunched inward, as if trying to make himself as small as possible. He wore an olive-drab field jacket that was frayed at the cuffs and collar. On the left shoulder, nearly washed out by decades of wear, was the screaming eagle patch of the 101st Airborne Division. The old man was digging frantically through a worn leather coin purse, his hands shaking violently. On the conveyor belt sat his meager rations, a single loaf of discounted white bread, a can of generic chicken soup, and a small bottle of store-brand aspirin. Behind the register was a teenage cashier, looking thoroughly bored and entirely unsympathetic. But the real problem was the man standing directly behind the veteran. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored gray suit that cost more than the veteran's entire wardrobe. He had a Bluetooth earpiece blinking blue in his right ear, and his face was twisted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered irritation. He was shifting his weight impatiently, sighing loudly enough to be heard over the store's soft rock radio station. Kaiser let out a low whine, a sound so deep it vibrated in Dave's boots. The dog was picking up on something. Something beyond just the awkward social tension of a slow checkout line. "Easy," Dave commanded. Though his own heart rate began to climb, he stepped closer, positioning himself behind a display of magazines, watching the scene unfold with the practiced eye of a man who had survived by reading a room before it exploded. Henry Pendleton was 78 years old, and he was terrified. He had survived the humid, blood-soaked jungles of the Ayadrang Valley. He had survived mortar fire that rained down like steel hail. He had survived the loss of his wife to cancer 5 years ago, and he had survived the slow, creeping isolation of outliving almost everyone who had ever truly known him. But right now, standing under the unforgiving glare of the supermarket lights, Henry felt a kind of raw, suffocating panic he hadn't experienced since 1968. The digital display on the cash register read, $11.42. Henry's hands, heavily spotted with age and trembling from the early stages of Parkinson's, sorted through the damp, crumpled bills on the metal counter. A $5 bill, 2 ones. He had thought he had a 10. He could have sworn he placed a $10 bill in his wallet on Sunday. "Sir," the teenage cashier said, snapping her chewing gum loudly. "It's 11:42. I know, sweetheart," Henry rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He felt the heat rising in his cheeks, a humiliating flush that made him feel like a scolded child. He began dumping pennies, nickels, and dimes from his leather pouch onto the counter. The coins clattered loudly, sounding like gunshots in his own ears. "Are you kidding me?" A booming voice barked from behind him. Henry flinched, pulling his shoulders tighter. Roger Morris, the man in the gray suit, checked his Rolex for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. "Listen, pal. Some of us actually have places to be. If you can't afford the bread, put it back. This isn't a charity kitchen." Henry didn't turn around. He couldn't. If he looked the man in the eye, he knew he would break. The pride that had kept him upright through a decade of living strictly on a meager Social Security check was fracturing. I have it," Henry mumbled, frantically pushing the dimes across the counter with a trembling index finger. "Just give me a moment." "You're holding up the whole line," Roger snapped, stepping aggressively close to Henry. The physical proximity was intentional. It was an act of intimidation. Roger loomed over the frail veteran, his expensive cologne heavy and sickening in the air. "Hey, kid," Roger yelled to the cashier. "Just void his transaction and ring my stuff up. I have a flight to catch. I can't void it until my manager turns the key," the girl said, looking overwhelmed. Henry finished counting the coins. His heart sank into his stomach. He was short. Not by a few pennies. $7.56, the cashier announced, looking at the meager pile of change and crumpled bills. "You're short $3.86, sir. 3美元86美分. It was an embarrassingly small amount of money. For the man in the suit behind him, it was less than the cost of a morning coffee. For Henry, it was an insurmountable wall. He looked at the bottle of aspirin. His joints had been burning with arthritis all week, keeping him awake through the long, lonely nights. He looked at the soup. It was the only meal he had planned for the next 2 days until his pension check cleared. I'll put the aspirin back, Henry said, his voice breaking. He reached out with a shaking hand to pull the small plastic bottle toward him. Oh, for God's sake, Roger growled, his patience entirely evaporated. Just move out of the way. Roger thrust his arm forward, aggressively shoving his own basket of groceries onto the conveyor belt. In doing so, his forearm slammed hard into Henry's shoulder. It wasn't a lethal blow, but to a frail, 78-year-old man, it was devastating. The impact knocked Henry off balance. He stumbled sideways, his worn boots slipping on the recently mopped floor. As he flailed to catch himself, his arm swept across the counter, knocking the carefully counted coins and the crumpled bills onto the floor. The coins scattered in a chaotic, humiliating rain. Henry hit the edge of the bagging carousel hard, gasping as the breath was knocked out of his lungs. He slid down, his knees hitting the cold linoleum, instantly dropping to his hands and knees in a desperate, panicked attempt to gather his scattered money. "Watch where you're going, old man," Roger sneered, stepping over Henry's trembling hand to move his basket forward. 10 yards away, Dave Reynolds had seen enough. The righteous anger of a United States Marine flared hot and fast in his chest. Nobody treated a veteran like that. Nobody laid hands on an old man. "Wait here," Dave muttered, dropping his own basket and reaching for his back pocket to grab his wallet. He was going to pay the $3.86, and then he was going to have a very quiet, very terrifying conversation with the man in the gray suit about the concept of respect. But Dave didn't even get the chance to take a second step. Kaiser went absolute ballistic. The transformation was terrifying. 1 second, Kaiser was a disciplined service animal sitting at attention. The next, he was a 90-pound kinetic missile of muscle and teeth. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. True aggression in a highly trained combat canine is dead silent, which makes it infinitely more horrifying. Kaiser hit the end of his leather leash with such explosive force that the heavy brass clips snapped like a brittle twig. "Kaiser! No!" Dave roared, shock coursing through his veins. Kaiser had never, not once in the 3 years since he left the SEALs, broken command. But Kaiser wasn't attacking. He was executing a threat neutralization protocol he hadn't used since the mountains of Yemen. The shepherd cleared the 10 yards in under 2 seconds. Roger Morris barely had time to register the blur of black and mahogany rushing toward him. He opened his mouth to shout, but the sound never came out. Kaiser didn't bite him. He didn't need to. The dog launched himself into the air, his massive chest slamming directly into Roger's sternum with the force of a battering ram. The impact lifted the 200-pound businessman clean off his feet. Roger flew backward, crashing violently into a display of glass-bottled sparkling water. The display shattered, sending hundreds of glass shards and gallons of carbonated water exploding across the aisle. Roger hit the floor with a wet, breathless thud, completely incapacitated. Before the man could even think about moving, Kaiser was standing over him. The dog planted his front paws heavily on Roger's chest, pinning him to the ground. Now, the dog growled. It was a demonic rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very floorboards. Kaiser's lips curled back, exposing 2 inches of razor-sharp canine teeth, resting less than an inch from Roger's pale, terrified throat. "Don't move! Nobody move!" Dave yelled, sprinting forward, his bad leg protesting sharply. The entire store had frozen. The cashier was screaming. Shoppers in adjacent aisles were pulling out their phones, terrified. Dave reached Kaiser, grabbing the heavy leather handle on the dog's tactical vest. "Aus! Out!" Dave commanded in German, pulling back with all his strength. Kaiser instantly stopped growling. He stepped off the weeping, hyperventilating businessman, but he didn't retreat. Instead, the dog immediately spun around, completely ignoring Dave, and lunged toward Henry Pendleton. "Kaiser!" Dave yelled, panic gripping him. If the dog bit the old man, they would put him down. The state would execute his brother's dog. But Kaiser didn't bite Henry. The old man was still on his knees, surrounded by his scattered pennies. But something was horribly wrong. Henry wasn't looking at the money anymore. His face had turned a terrifying, ashen shade of gray. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his hands were clawing desperately at his own chest, tearing at the fabric of his faded field jacket. He couldn't breathe. Kaiser shoved his massive head forcefully under Henry's armpit, lifting the old man's torso up, preventing him from collapsing face first onto the hard floor. The dog then began to bark a sharp, rhythmic, deafening bark. Bark, bark, bark. It wasn't an aggressive sound. Dave recognized it instantly, and his blood ran cold. It was the medical alert bark. Kaiser was trained to smell the massive, sudden spike in specific enzymes and the drastic drop in blood pressure that preceded a catastrophic cardiovascular event. "Call 911, Dave bellowed at the screaming cashier, dropping to his knees beside Henry and the dog. "He's having a massive heart attack. Call a bus now." Henry's lips were turning blue. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his body went entirely limp, slumping heavily against Kaiser's sturdy side. The dog held his ground, bearing the old man's weight like a furry pillar, whining softly now, licking Henry's pale face to keep him conscious. "Hang on, brother. Hang on," Dave said, grabbing Henry's shoulders and gently laying him flat on his back on the wet linoleum. Dave ripped open the veteran's jacket to check his airway. As Dave tore the jacket open, something fell out of the interior breast pocket. It was a small, ancient leather wallet, bound together by heavy rubber bands. When it hit the floor, the bands snapped, and the contents spilled out across the wet floor, mixing with the scattered pennies and dimes. Dave ignored it, pressing his fingers to Henry's neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, thready, slipping away fast. "Where is that ambulance?" Dave screamed over his shoulder. "They're 3 minutes out," someone from the crowd yelled back. Dave positioned his hands over Henry's sternum, preparing to start CPR. But as he locked his elbows, his eyes caught sight of the items that had spilled from Henry's broken wallet. There were no credit cards, no pictures of grandchildren. There was a worn, tarnished Silver Star medal. There was a folded, yellowed telegram from the Department of Defense dated 1969. And there was a photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded and cracked with age. It showed 2 young, smiling soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam, covered in mud, holding M16 rifles. Dave stared at the photograph, his breath catching in his throat. The world around him, the sirens wailing in the distance, the whimpering of the businessman on the floor, the frantic barking of Kaiser, all of it faded into absolute, dead silence. Dave knew the man on the right in the photograph. He had seen that face every day of his childhood. He had looked at that exact face in his own family photo albums. The man smiling in the mud, standing shoulder to shoulder with a young Henry Pendleton, was Dave's grandfather. "Grandpa," Dave whispered, his hands trembling violently above Henry's chest. Henry gave a sudden, terrifying gasp, his chest convulsing. Kaiser let out a mournful howl, pressing his nose hard into Henry's unmoving hand. The $3.86 the man had been short for a loaf of bread was scattered around them like worthless metal, while a debt of a vastly different kind, spanning 3 generations and 2 wars, suddenly demanded to be paid. The revelation hit Dave like a physical blow, paralyzing him for a fraction of a second. The man dying on the cold floor of a discount grocery store wasn't just a stranger. He was a ghost from a photograph that sat on the mantel of Dave's childhood home. He was a piece of the Reynolds family history, bleeding out into the linoleum. But the harsh, wet rasp of Henry's failing lungs shattered Dave's paralysis. "Not today," Dave snarled, his military training overriding the shock. "You are not dying on my watch. Not today." Dave locked his hands together, placing the heel of his palm directly over Henry's sternum. He locked his elbows and dropped his weight. Crunch. The sickening sound of fragile, aged ribs giving way under the pressure echoed in the quiet space of the aisle. Dave hated that sound, but he knew it meant he was compressing deep enough to manually pump the blood through Henry's failing heart. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dave counted out loud, his voice tight with exertion. The physical toll of CPR is immense, and within 30 seconds, sweat was stinging Dave's eyes. His bad leg screamed in protest from the awkward kneeling position, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Beside him, Kaiser was a statue of intense focus. The massive dog had backed up exactly 2 feet to give Dave room to work. But his golden eyes never left Henry's face. He let out a rhythmic, distressed whine, his nose twitching as he continued to monitor the chemical changes in the old man's sweat and breath. Across the aisle, Roger Morris was finally managing to sit up. The businessman was covered in sticky, carbonated water and surrounded by shattered glass. His face was purple with rage. "I'm pressing charges," Roger bellowed, clutching his chest where Kaiser had rammed him. "That beast tried to kill me. He's a menace. I'll have that dog put down and I'll sue you for everything you—" "Shut your mouth!" Dave roared, not missing a beat in his chest compressions. He didn't look up, but the lethal edge in his voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who had commanded troops under heavy fire. "If you say one more word, I will let go of this man's chest. I will walk over there, and I will show you what a real assault looks like. Stay on the ground." Roger's mouth snapped shut. He looked at the crazed intensity in Dave's eyes, then at the muscular German shepherd that was now staring directly at him, lips peeled back in a silent, terrifying warning. Roger didn't say another word. The wail of sirens finally cut through the tense air, growing louder until the flashing red and white lights painted the front windows of Carter's family market. The automatic doors slid open, and 2 paramedics rushed in, heavily burdened with trauma bags and an AED monitor. "Talk to me!" The lead paramedic, a burly man named Henderson, shouted as he slid to his knees on the opposite side of Henry. 78-year-old male. Collapsed 3 minutes ago, Dave rattled off, gasping for air as he kept pumping. Possible massive myocardial infarction. No pulse. Not breathing. I started compressions 2.5 minutes ago. "Good work, Marine. We've got him," Henderson said, tearing open Henry's shirt completely. "Swap out on 3. 1, 2, 3. Dave fell back, his chest heaving, his arms trembling from the exertion. He pulled Kaiser close, wrapping his arm around the dog's thick neck. "Good boy," he whispered into the dog's fur. "You did good, Kay." The paramedics worked with practiced, ruthless efficiency. Pads were slapped onto Henry's pale chest. The machine whined as it charged. "V-fib," the second paramedic announced, looking at the monitor. "He's fibrillating. Charging to 200. Clear," Henderson shouted. Dave pulled Kaiser further back. The paramedic hit the button. Henry's fragile body jolted violently off the floor. The store held its collective breath. The monitor beeped a chaotic, erratic sound, and then settled into a terrifying, flat tone. "Nothing. Pushing epi," Henderson said, his face grim. "Resume compressions." For 3 agonizing minutes, they fought a desperate battle against the inevitable. Dave watched the old man's face, the face that had smiled beside his grandfather in a jungle halfway across the world, fading away into a waxy gray. "Come on," Dave whispered. "Fight back." Charging to 300, Henderson called out. "Clear." Another violent jolt. Silence. And then, beep, beep, beep. It was weak. It was incredibly slow. But it was there. "We got a rhythm." The second paramedic sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Faint pulse. He's trying to breathe on his own, but it's shallow. We need to move him now." They rolled Henry onto a backboard and hoisted him onto the gurney. As they rushed him toward the exit, Dave scrambled on his hands and knees across the wet, sticky floor. He ignored the stares of the police officers who had just arrived. He ignored the puddle of carbonated water. His hands frantically gathered the scattered contents of Henry's broken wallet, the worn pennies, the tarnished silver star, the faded telegram, and the Polaroid. He shoved them into his own jacket pocket, stood up, and clipped a new, tactical carabiner from his belt onto Kaiser's harness. "Where are they taking him?" Dave asked the nearest police officer. "Highgrove Memorial," the cop replied, eyeing Kaiser warily. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about the altercation with Mr. Morris over there." Dave pulled out his military ID and shoved it into the officer's hand. Corporal David Reynolds, USMC, medically retired. The man on the floor assaulted an elderly veteran, caused him to go into cardiac arrest, and my service animal executed a non-lethal interdiction to prevent further harm. Get the security footage. I'm going to the hospital. Without waiting for a response, Dave turned and limped out into the freezing rain, Kaiser glued perfectly to his side. The waiting room of Highgrove Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit smelled of bleach, stale coffee, and quiet desperation. It was a smell Dave knew intimately from his months at Walter Reed. It was the scent of suspended animation, where time stopped, and families waited to see if their lives would be permanently destroyed. It was 2:15 a.m. The rain had turned into a sleet storm, rattling against the large plate glass windows. Dave sat in a horribly uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room. Kaiser was curled into a tight ball at his feet, his chin resting on Dave's boot. The dog was exhausted. The chemical adrenaline dump of a threat neutralization, combined with a medical alert, was incredibly taxing on a canine's nervous system. The police had come and gone. After reviewing the supermarket's high-definition security footage, they saw exactly what happened. Roger Morris had forcefully shoved an elderly man, causing a life-threatening medical event. The police informed Dave that Morris was not only dropping the threat of a lawsuit but was currently being processed at the county jail for assault and battery on a senior citizen. But Dave didn't care about Morris anymore. His attention was entirely consumed by the items spread out on the small, cheap coffee table in front of him. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the Polaroid photograph looked even more fragile. Dave traced the edge of the image with his thumb. There was his grandfather, William Reynolds, looking impossibly young. He had the exact same jawline as Dave, the same slight crook in his nose, and standing next to him, arm draped casually over William's shoulder, was a young Henry Pendleton. They were covered in mud, exhausted, but smiling with the fierce, unbreakable camaraderie that only combat veterans understand. Dave carefully unfolded the yellowed telegram. The paper was brittle, tearing slightly at the creases. It was dated the 14th of November 1968. It wasn't from the Department of Defense. It was a Western Union telegram addressed to Henry Pendleton, care of an Army hospital in Japan. It read, "Henry, I live because of you. Doctors say I get to keep the leg. Mary is pregnant. If it's a boy, his middle name is Henry. You owe me a beer when you get stateside. Brothers forever. William Reynolds." Dave stared at the telegram until the words blurred. Henry hadn't just served with his grandfather. Henry had saved his life. Dave pulled out his phone. He still had contacts, buddies who worked in records and intelligence. It took 3 phone calls and a massive favor called in to a gunnery sergeant stationed at the Pentagon. But an hour later, an encrypted file dropped into Dave's secure email. It was the after-action report from the 12th of November, 1968. The Ayadrang Valley. Dave read the sanitized military jargon, translating it in his head into the blood and chaos of reality. William Reynolds' platoon had been ambushed, pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. William had taken a round to the femoral artery. He was bleeding out in the mud, trapped behind a fallen log, completely cut off from his squad. The report detailed how Specialist 4th Class Henry Pendleton, the platoon medic, had deliberately broken cover. He had run 40 yards through a sustained kill zone. He took a piece of shrapnel to the abdomen, but he didn't stop. He reached William, clamped the artery with his bare hands, and physically dragged a man who outweighed him by 50 pounds back to safety under heavy mortar fire. Henry Pendleton had traded his own body to save William Reynolds. For his actions, Henry was awarded the Silver Star, the same tarnished metal that had spilled onto the wet floor of Carter's family market. Because of Henry, William survived. William went home. William married Mary. They had a son. That son grew up and had 2 boys of his own, Thomas and David. "My God," Dave whispered, running a trembling hand through his short hair. "I wouldn't even exist if it weren't for him." Thomas wouldn't have existed. Dave looked down at the $3.86 he had recovered from the floor. A handful of sticky dimes, pennies, and 2 crumpled bills. A man who had run through machine gun fire, a man who had secured the future of Dave's entire bloodline, had been publicly humiliated and nearly killed over $3.86 for a loaf of cheap bread. A deep, burning shame settled into Dave's stomach. How could society let this happen? How had a hero been reduced to counting pennies? Starving, shivering in a thin field jacket, the heavy double doors of the ICU hissed open. A tired-looking doctor with dark circles under his eyes stepped out, looking around the empty waiting room before his eyes landed on Dave and the massive dog. "Corporal Reynolds?" the doctor asked, walking over. Dave stood up instantly, his knee joint popping. "Yes, sir. How is he?" The doctor sighed, rubbing his temples. It was a massive widowmaker heart attack. His left anterior descending artery was almost completely blocked. We managed to get a stent in, and his rhythm has stabilized. But frankly, Mr. Reynolds, the heart attack is only part of the problem. "What do you mean?" Dave asked, his heart sinking. "Mr. Pendleton is suffering from severe, prolonged malnutrition," the doctor said quietly. "His body has been consuming its own muscle mass to survive. His immune system is virtually non-existent, and he has untreated Parkinson's disease. The stress of the altercation, combined with his physical frailty, it was a perfect storm. It's a miracle he survived the ambulance ride. Is he awake?" "He's drifting in and out," the doctor said. "He's confused. He keeps asking about his money. He's incredibly distressed about his wallet." Dave reached into his pocket and felt the worn leather of Henry's coin purse. "Can I see him?" The doctor looked at Kaiser. "Hospital policy strictly forbids. He's a federally protected multi-million-dollar asset belonging to the United States government, Doc." Dave lied smoothly, adopting his best command voice. "And he's the only reason that man is alive right now. Where I go, the dog goes." The doctor hesitated, then gave a defeated nod. "Room 4. 5 minutes. Keep the dog away from the IV lines." Room 4 was bathed in the dim blue glow of medical monitors. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the heart rate machine was a comforting contrast to the flatline Dave had heard in the grocery store. Henry looked impossibly small in the center of the large hospital bed. An oxygen cannula rested under his nose, and his thin arms were bruised from a dozen IV lines. He looked like a stiff breeze would turn him to dust. As Dave stepped into the room, Kaiser immediately moved forward. The dog didn't jump up. He walked to the edge of the bed and gently rested his massive, heavy head on the mattress, right next to Henry's frail, sleeping hand. Kaiser let out a long, soft breath, his warm air blowing across the old man's knuckles. The sensation woke Henry. The old man's eyelids fluttered open. It took a moment for his milky eyes to focus in the dim light. When he saw the terrifyingly large head of the black German shepherd inches from his hand, he didn't panic. A weak, trembling smile touched the corners of his pale lips. "Hey there, soldier," Henry rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. He slowly, painfully, lifted a trembling finger and stroked Kaiser's soft ears. "You're the one, from the store. You knocked that awful man down." "He doesn't usually do that," Dave said quietly, stepping out of the shadows and moving to the foot of the bed. "His name is Kaiser. He used to belong to my brother. SEAL. Team 6. Henry's eyes shifted from the dog to Dave. He took in the military bearing, the posture, the intense eyes. "A SEAL dog," Henry murmured. "No wonder. He kept me awake on the floor. I felt his nose. He knew you were in trouble before you did," Dave said, pulling up a plastic chair and sitting down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "How are you feeling, Henry?" Henry blinked, a flash of panic crossing his face. My wallet. The money on the floor. I have to pay for the bread. If I don't pay, they'll call the police. I don't want any trouble." The pure, unfiltered terror in the old man's voice over a loaf of bread broke something deep inside Dave. Dave reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch. He placed it gently on the rolling tray table next to the bed. "The bread is paid for, Henry. The man who pushed you is in jail. You don't have to worry about anything." Henry let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for decades. "Thank you. Thank you, young man. I get so confused lately. The money gets so tight." Dave stared at the floor for a long moment, gathering his courage. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver star, the yellowed telegram, and the Polaroid. He laid them out on the tray table, right next to the coin purse. Henry's eyes widened. The color drained from his face entirely. He reached out with a violently shaking hand, his fingers hovering over the photograph. Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "They fell out of your jacket when I was doing CPR," Dave said softly. Henry squeezed his eyes shut, two thick tears leaking out and rolling down the deep wrinkles of his cheeks. "I didn't want anyone to see those. I didn't want anyone to know." "Why?" Dave asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Henry, you won the Silver Star. You're a hero. Why are you living like this? Why are you starving over $3? Henry kept his eyes closed. "Because I didn't save everyone," he whispered, the guilt of 50 years pouring out into the sterile room. "I saved William. But I couldn't save Cooper. I couldn't save Davis. They bled out right next to me. They pinned a medal on my chest for the one man I carried out, but I left 2 behind in the mud. I didn't deserve a parade. I didn't deserve a pension. I took the medal, and I vanished." Dave felt a lump form in his throat. Survivor's guilt. It was a poison Dave knew well. It was the same poison that had been slowly killing Dave since he lost his brother in Yemen. Henry had spent 50 years punishing himself for the men he couldn't save, denying himself any comfort, any joy, living in absolute poverty as a self-imposed penance. "Henry," Dave said softly, pointing to the photograph, "do you know who I am?" Henry finally opened his eyes, looking at Dave. He studied Dave's face, tracing the jawline, the nose, the eyes. Slowly, recognition began to dawn, followed by absolute shock. "You look," Henry gasped, his hand moving to his chest. "You look just like." "My name is David Reynolds," Dave said, a tear finally escaping his eye. "William was my grandfather. He passed away 12 years ago." Henry let out a choked sob, covering his face with his trembling hands. "William's boy. Oh, God. You're William's boy." "I am," Dave said. "And my brother, Thomas." His middle name was Henry. Henry wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the agonizing, soul-tearing weeping of a man who had carried an unbearable weight for half a century. Kaiser whined, standing up on his hind legs to press his chest against the hospital bed, aggressively licking the tears off Henry's hands in a desperate attempt to comfort him. "I promised him." Henry sobbed into the dog's fur. "When William went home, I promised I would check on his family. I tracked you all down 20 years ago. I moved to Highgrove just to be near you, but when I saw you, when I saw William's beautiful house and his kids, I couldn't do it. I was a broken, penniless man. I was a failure. I couldn't walk up to his door and show him what a wreck I'd become. So I just watched. I watched you boys grow up from a distance. I went to your high school football games. I watched you leave for the Marines. I just wanted to make sure you were all okay." Dave was openly crying now. This frail, starving man had been their silent guardian angel, living in the shadows, too ashamed to claim the massive debt the Reynolds family owed him. "And the money?" Dave asked, wiping his face. "Why didn't you have money for food, Henry?" Henry looked away, ashamed. "The state cemetery. There's a plot right near Williams. I've been saving for 5 years to buy it. I wanted to be buried near him. It cost $2,000. I have $1,996 saved under my mattress. I just needed $4 more. That's why I couldn't pay for the bread. If I spent my savings, I wouldn't be able to buy the plot before I died. I wanted to be near him." Dave felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. Henry wasn't starving because he was completely destitute. He was intentionally starving himself to save pennies so he could be buried next to the man he saved 50 years ago. Dave stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He leaned over the bed, taking both of Henry's frail, cold hands in his own. "Henry," Dave said, his voice fierce and unwavering, "you listen to me. Your watch is over. The penance is done." Henry looked up, his eyes wide and vulnerable. "You saved my grandfather. You gave me my life. You gave my brother his life," Dave said, gripping the old man's hands tightly. "You don't need to save for a cemetery plot. You're coming home with me. You're going to live in my house. You're going to eat at my table. And when the time comes, a long time from now, I will personally carry your casket and bury you right next to William with full military honors. Do you understand me?" Henry stared at him, his mouth open, unable to speak. The crushing weight of his 50-year exile was suddenly lifted, replaced by a grace he never thought he deserved. Kaiser let out a loud, definitive huff, resting his heavy head directly over Henry's racing heart, anchoring the old man to the present, anchoring him to the family he had saved. The transition from the sterile environment of Highgrove Memorial to the harsh reality of Henry's daily life was a sobering experience for Dave. Henry spent a grueling 10 days in the cardiac ward. During that time, Dave rarely left his side, and Kaiser never did. The Navy SEAL K-9 had essentially adopted the elderly veteran, curling up at the foot of his hospital bed, only leaving when Dave issued a strict command for outdoor bathroom breaks. On the morning of the discharge, Dr. Harrison, a no-nonsense cardiologist, pulled Dave into the hallway. "He's stable, Corporal," Dr. Harrison said, reviewing a chart on his tablet. "The stent is holding, and we've got him on a regimen for the Parkinson's tremors. But you need to understand the fragility of his situation. He cannot return to living alone. The malnutrition has ravaged his bone density. If he falls, he shatters. If he misses his medication, the heart will fail. He needs 24-hour monitoring. He's coming home with me, Doc," Dave affirmed, signing the discharge papers without hesitation. "I've got the space, and I've got the time." "Good." The doctor nodded. Because whatever environment he was surviving in before, it was killing him faster than his heart was. 2 hours later, Dave's heavy-duty pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Terrace apartments on the impoverished east side of Highgrove. The name was a cruel joke. The building was a decaying, brutalist block of concrete, its windows barred, the fire escapes rusted into jagged, unsafe webs. Henry sat in the passenger seat, his thin frame swallowed by a warm fleece jacket Dave had bought for him. He stared out the window, a look of profound shame washing over his face. "You don't have to go in there, David. It's not fit for company. We're just getting your things, Henry. The money, your paperwork, your clothes," Dave said gently, putting the truck in park. He stepped out, walked around the hood, and helped the old man down. Kaiser immediately flanked Henry's right side, pressing his heavy shoulder lightly against the veteran's leg to offer physical stability as they walked. Apartment 2B was a sensory nightmare. When Dave unlocked the flimsy, hollow-core door, the smell of damp rot, cheap bleach, and stale air hit him like a physical wall. The apartment consisted of a single room. The walls were peeling with lead paint. A tiny, rusted radiator hissed weakly in the corner, failing entirely to combat the winter chill. The refrigerator in the kitchenette hummed with a broken, rattling noise, but it was the stark emptiness of the room that broke Dave's heart. There was no television, no radio, no books. The only furniture was a folding metal chair and a twin mattress lying directly on the stained linoleum floor. The kitchen cabinets were standing open and completely bare, save for a single half-empty jar of instant coffee. Henry had been living in solitary confinement of his own making. "Under the mattress," Henry whispered, standing near the doorway, unable to look Dave in the eye. "There's a loose floorboard." Dave crossed the room, grabbed the edge of the stained mattress, and hauled it aside. Beneath the rotting linoleum, exactly as Henry had described, was a loose wooden board. Dave pried it up with his pocket knife. Inside the dusty cavity sat an old, rusted Folgers coffee can. Dave pulled the can out and popped the plastic lid. Inside were stacks of crumpled $1, $5, and $10 bills, meticulously rubber-banded together. It was the $1,996, the price of a plot at the state cemetery, the price of a slow, agonizing starvation. Dave closed the lid tightly and stood up. He looked around the desolate room one last time. This was how America had allowed a Silver Star recipient to live. This was the dark, shameful underbelly of the country's promise to its heroes. "We're done here," Dave said, his voice thick with suppressed rage. Not at Henry, but at the system. "Leave the clothes. Leave everything else. We'll buy you a whole new wardrobe this afternoon. You are never setting foot in this place again." As they turned to leave, a heavy, aggressive knocking echoed from the open doorway. A large, greasy-looking man in a stained tank top was leaning against the doorframe, chewing on a toothpick. He was the building's slumlord, a local predator named Gary Sykes. "Well, well. Look who's moving out," Gary sneered, his eyes darting to the coffee can in Dave's hand. "Old Artie owes me rent for the next month, pal. You can't just break a lease without a penalty. I'm gonna need $500 out of that can before you leave." Dave stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly handed the coffee can to Henry. "Stay behind me," Dave murmured. Kaiser didn't need a command. The dog stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Henry and the landlord. The fur along Kaiser's spine bristled into a razor-sharp ridge. A low, vibrating growl began to rumble in his chest. "Henry is leaving," Dave said, his voice dropping into a register of icy, absolute authority. "And he doesn't owe you a dime. This place is a health hazard. If I called the housing authority right now, you'd be condemned by nightfall." "Listen here, you crippled punk," Gary began, taking a threatening step into the room. It was a catastrophic mistake. Kaiser snapped his jaws, a loud, explosive clack of teeth that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. He didn't bite, but he lunged forward 6 inches, executing a perfect mock strike. Gary shrieked, scrambling backward so fast he tripped over his own boots, crashing into the hallway wall. "Get that beast away from me," Gary yelled, his face completely drained of color. "He's just doing his job," Dave said coldly, stepping past the terrified landlord, guiding Henry down the hallway. "And my job is making sure Henry never has to deal with parasites like you again. Don't ever contact him." They walked out into the freezing air, leaving the slumlord trembling on the floor. For the first time in 50 years, Henry Pendleton was going home. The transition to living in Dave's suburban 3-bedroom house was a profound culture shock for Henry. He was given the master guest suite on the first floor, equipped with an en-suite bathroom and a plush, orthopedically supported bed. For the first 3 nights, Henry couldn't sleep on the mattress. Dave found him curled up on the rug in the corner, overwhelmed by the sudden comfort, his mind still trapped in the survival mode of the slums. But with time, warm meals, and the constant, reassuring presence of Kaiser, who slept faithfully at the foot of Henry's bed every single night, the old man began to thaw. His cheeks regained their color. The Parkinson's tremors became manageable under proper medication. He began to smile, a genuine, warm expression that reminded Dave fiercely of his late grandfather. However, the world outside was not entirely finished with them. 3 weeks after Henry moved in, a sleek, black town car pulled into Dave's driveway. A man in a sharp suit walked up to the door and handed Dave a thick, manila envelope. It was a lawsuit. Roger Morris, the wealthy businessman from the grocery store, was not the type of man to let a public humiliation slide. Despite being charged with misdemeanor assault, his high-priced defense attorney, Gregory Finch, was fighting back with venomous aggression. Morris was suing Dave for $2.5 million. The documents outlined a ridiculous, fabricated narrative. Morris claimed that Henry had faked the heart attack to extort money, and that Dave had weaponized a dangerous, uncontrolled attack dog to inflict permanent psychological trauma and physical injury upon him. Morris claimed he was suffering from PTSD, unable to work, and demanded Kaiser be seized by animal control and euthanized as a public threat. The threat to Kaiser was the one thing that could send Dave into a blind rage. "They're trying to take the dog," Dave told Henry that evening in the kitchen, his hands shaking as he gripped the legal papers. "They're trying to say Kaiser is a rabid animal. They want him put down." Henry looked horrified. He reached down to stroke Kaiser's head. "They can't. He saved my life. He saved Morris from walking away a murderer. I have a meeting with my lawyer tomorrow, and Detective Cooper at the precinct," Dave said, his jaw clenched tight. "I'm not letting that arrogant scumbag touch my dog. I will burn my house down and use the ashes to pay legal fees before I let them take Kaiser." The following morning, Dave sat in the sterile conference room of the Highgrove Police Department. Across the table sat Detective Cooper, a weary veteran of the force, along with Dave's court-appointed lawyer, and Gregory Finch, Morris's slick attorney. Roger Morris sat beside his lawyer, wearing a neck brace that Dave knew for a fact he didn't need, looking smug and untouchable. "The facts are simple," Finch stated smoothly, laying a printed photograph of Morris's bruised chest on the table. "Your client, Mr. Reynolds, released a lethal weapon on a civilian over a simple misunderstanding in a grocery line. The dog is untrained, violent, and a menace. We are offering a settlement, $1 million, and the dog is surrendered to the county for humane destruction. Otherwise, we destroy you in civil court." Dave felt his blood boil. He opened his mouth to speak, but Detective Cooper held up a hand. "Mr. Finch," Detective Cooper said slowly, leaning back in his chair, "before we discuss settlements or destroying a decorated military K-9, I think there's a piece of evidence your client failed to mention to you." Finch frowned. "We have the security footage, Detective. It clearly shows the dog attacking my client unprovoked. The store security camera is mounted in the ceiling, 60 feet away, with a blind spot obscured by an advertising banner," Cooper corrected. "It shows a scuffle, but no audio, and no clear instigation, which is why your client felt confident spinning this fairy tale." Cooper pulled a laptop from his briefcase, turned it around, and hit play. The screen didn't show the grainy, silent security feed. It showed crisp, high-definition cell phone footage. "This," Cooper explained, "was submitted to us yesterday by Chloe Harper, the 19-year-old cashier working Register 3. She was filming a TikTok video of her shift. Just as the altercation started, the camera was sitting on her register, recording the entire incident from 5 feet away, with perfect audio. On the screen, Henry's frail voice could be heard clearly. I'll put the aspirin back. Then, Morris's booming, cruel voice shattered the room. "Oh, for God's sake, just move out of the way." The video clearly showed Morris aggressively shoving his basket forward, deliberately striking Henry with his forearm. It captured Henry's terrified gasp, the sound of the coins scattering, and the old man hitting the bagging carousel with a sickening thud. But the video showed more. It showed Morris laughing. It showed him stepping over Henry's trembling body. And then, it showed Kaiser. The video captured the absolute precision of the dog's movement. He didn't bite. He didn't maul. He executed a flawless, non-lethal kinetic strike, pinning Morris to the ground, neutralizing the threat before instantly pivoting to save Henry's life with the medical alert. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening as the video ended. Roger Morris had turned the color of ash. The smugness had evaporated, replaced by pure, undiluted panic. Gregory Finch slowly closed his briefcase. He didn't look at his client. "Detective, I was unaware of this footage." "I figured," Cooper said dryly. "Mr. Morris, not only does this completely invalidate your civil suit, but the district attorney has reviewed this footage. We are upgrading your charges. You are no longer facing misdemeanor assault. You are being charged with aggravated assault on an elderly person and reckless endangerment resulting in bodily injury. Both are felonies," Morris stammered, looking at his lawyer. "Greg, do something." "I'm withdrawing as your counsel, Roger," Finch said, standing up. "You lied to me. Good luck." Dave stood up, picking up his cane. He leaned across the table, his face inches from the terrified businessman. You thought because he was old and poor. He was invisible, Dave whispered, his voice like grinding stones. You thought you could buy your way out of the truth, but you picked the wrong veteran, the wrong Marine, and the wrong damn dog. Dave walked out of the precinct, the cool autumn air filling his lungs. The threat was over. Kaiser was safe. Henry was safe. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered on a silver platter. 6 months later, the harsh winter had surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring. The grass in the Highgrove State Cemetery was a brilliant emerald green, wet with morning dew. The cemetery was vast, a rolling sea of pristine white marble headstones standing in perfect, unbroken formation. Dave stood silently, wearing his dress blues, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. Beside him stood Henry. The transformation in the elderly man was nothing short of miraculous. He had gained 30 pounds of healthy weight. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that Dave had bought him, and he stood perfectly upright, resting his hands on a polished wooden cane. His eyes were clear, bright, and filled with a peace he hadn't known since 1968. Sitting perfectly at attention between the two men was Kaiser. The German shepherd's coat gleamed in the sunlight, a vibrant testament to his strength and discipline. They stood before a headstone marked, William Reynolds, SGT U.S. Army, Vietnam, beloved husband and father. Henry stepped forward slowly. The crunch of his dress shoes on the gravel path was the only sound in the quiet morning air. He reached out with a trembling, age-spotted hand and gently traced the engraved letters of his best friend's name. Hello, William, Henry said, his voice soft, steady, and devoid of the heavy grief that used to anchor it. It's been a long time. I'm sorry it took me so long to come see you properly. Dave took a step back, giving the man his privacy, though he could hear every word. I kept my promise, Willie, Henry continued, a tear slipping down his cheek, catching the sunlight. I watched over your boys. They grew up strong. They grew up brave. Thomas, he was a hero. And David, Henry looked over his shoulder at Dave, a profound love shining in his eyes. David saved me. I thought my life was over. Willie, I thought I was just waiting to turn to dust. But your grandson, he brought me back from the dark. Henry reached into the breast pocket of his suit. He pulled out the old, tarnished, silver star. I carried this for 50 years because I felt like a fraud, Henry whispered to the headstone. I thought it was a symbol of the men I couldn't save. But David made me realize, it's a symbol of the man I did. It's a symbol of you, William, and the family you got to have. Henry knelt down, a difficult maneuver even with the cane. But he managed it with a quiet dignity. He placed the silver star directly against the base of the white marble headstone. I don't need it anymore, Henry said, his voice breaking with a beautiful, tragic release. My penance is done. I'm going to live the rest of my days in the light. With our family, as Henry struggled to stand back up, Kaiser stepped forward instinctively. The massive dog offered his sturdy back, standing rigid like a statue, allowing Henry to lean his weight onto the canine harness to pull himself upright. Dave walked forward, wrapping a strong arm around Henry's shoulders. He'd be proud of you, Henry, Dave said softly. He always was. I know, Henry smiled, wiping his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. I finally know. They turned and walked away from the grave, 3 soldiers, an old medic, a young Marine, and a warrior dog bound together by a legacy of blood, sacrifice, and a grocery store encounter that had changed all of their destinies. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, and the future, for the first time in decades, was bathed in light. Sometimes, the universe places us exactly where we need to be, even if it's in the checkout line of a discount grocery store. Henry's story is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear faded field jackets and count pennies to survive. And sometimes, the most profound interventions come from the silent intuition of a loyal canine. We owe our veterans and the incredible service animals that support them a debt of gratitude that can never truly be repaid, but we must never stop trying. If this incredible story of honor, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a Navy SEAL dog and his family touched your heart, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and family to honor all those who have served and sacrificed for our freedom. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more breathtaking real-life stories that prove miracles happen every day. See you in the next one.